At the family dinner, Dad said, "I'm proud of all my children. Except the loser sitting at the table." Everyone laughed. I stood up, placed a secret paper on the table and said, "For you, Dad. Happy Father's Day." Then I walked outside, took back the luxury car I gave him, and moments later he screamed when he finally opened it. I did not run. Running implies guilt or fear, or the frantic energy of someone who thinks they have something left to lose. I walked with the steady, measured pace of an auditor leaving a site after finding the discrepancy that brings the whole operation down. My heels clicked against the pavement of the driveway, a sharp, rhythmic metronome counting down the final seconds of my father's delusion. The car sat, waiting for me under the portico. A custom Porsche 911, painted in a deep midnight blue that looked black until the light hit it just right. It had cost $115,000. I had paid for it in cash 3 days ago. My father had spent the last 20 minutes bragging about this car to my brothers, assuming it was his Father's Day gift. He had assumed that despite the insults, despite the years of treating me like office furniture, I would still seek to buy his affection with six-figure toys. He was wrong. It wasn't a gift, it was a getaway vehicle. I opened the driver's side door and slid into the seat. The smell hit me instantly, a rich, heady mix of expensive leather and new manufacturing. It smelled like victory. I pulled the heavy door shut, and the world outside vanished. The chaotic noise of the dinner party, the clinking of silverware, the laughter that had been at my expense, it was all severed by the solid thud of German engineering. Inside it was hermetically sealed, quiet, safe. I pressed the start button. The engine roared to life, a low guttural growl of 400 horsepower waking up. That was when the front door of the house flew open. James ran out onto the porch. He looked frantic, his face a mask of confusion that was rapidly curdling into rage. He was shouting something, his mouth opening and closing like a fish, gasping for air, but I couldn't hear him. The glass and the steel and the engine insulated me from his voice for the first time in 26 years. He stumbled down the steps, waving his arms, pointing at the car, pointing at me. He looked smaller than I remembered. Without the head of the table to frame him, without his sycophantic sons to amplify him, he was just an angry man in a suit that I now effectively owned. He reached the driveway and lunged for the door handle. I watched the latch click uselessly against the lock. I didn't roll down the window. I didn't look away. I turned my head and met his eyes through the tinted glass. I saw the moment the fear hit him. He wasn't scared because I was taking the car. He was scared because for the first time I was looking at him not as a daughter looks at a father but as a CEO looks at a liability. I shifted the car into drive. I didn't peel out. I didn't screech the tires. That would have been emotional. That would have been dramatic. Instead, I eased the car forward with precision, forcing him to step back or be run over. He stepped back. As I rolled down the long winding driveway of the lakeside estate, I checked the rearview mirror. James was standing alone in the gravel, shrinking with every yard of distance I put between us. Tyler and Lucas had spilled out onto the porch behind him, looking like confused children who had just been told playtime was over. I merged onto the highway and let the car do what it was built to do. The speed pressed me back into the seat, a physical embrace of the power I had denied myself for too long. For 26 years I had been the spare part, the backup plan, the invisible girl who was too fragile for the heavy lifting of the real estate world. They had trained me to be silent, thinking it would make me compliant. They never realized that silence is where you do your best thinking. It is where you read the fine print. It is where you plan the hostile takeover. I drove toward the city skyline, toward the glass tower that bore our family name. My name. The dinner was over. The war had just begun. 2 hours earlier, the air in the dining room had been thick with the smell of roasted lamb and self-congratulation. It was supposed to be a victory dinner. James had gathered us all at the lakeside estate to announce his promotion to CEO of Sterling & Stone, the firm he had dedicated 30 years of his life to building. The crystal was polished, the vintage wine was breathing, and I was sitting at the far end of the table, quiet, observant, invisible. My brothers Tyler and Lucas sat on either side of my father like princes waiting for their coronation. Tyler, 29, was an architect who had never designed a building that didn't go over budget and under code. Lucas, 24, was a lifestyle influencer whose primary influence was draining the family trust to fund trips to Dubai. They were loud, charismatic, and utterly incompetent. They were everything James valued. James stood up, tapping his glass with a silver spoon. To legacy, he began, his voice booming with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. As I step up to lead the firm into a new era, I've decided it's time to secure the future of this family. He looked at Tyler, he looked at Lucas, he didn't look at me. I am transferring the management of the legacy portfolio, our most valuable commercial assets, to my sons. Tyler will handle development. Lucas will handle branding. The brothers beamed, clinking their glasses. Tyler shot me a smirk, the kind that said, "Know your place." And Morgan James finally turned his gaze toward me. It wasn't malicious. It was pitying. "Morgan, darling, you're too fragile for this world. Real estate is a blood sport. It requires a killer instinct you just don't have. But don't worry, your brothers are generous. They'll make sure you're looked after when I'm gone." Fragile. The word hung in the air, suspended in the silence of the room. I looked down at my plate, letting the insult settle. He didn't see a strategist. He didn't see an investor. He saw a liability. He saw a quiet girl who needed protection because she didn't bang her chest and demand attention. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that silence isn't emptiness. It's camouflage. For 10 years, I had been the architect of silence. While they were busy talking over me at dinner, I was listening. While they were bragging about deals they barely understood, I was reading the contracts they left on the coffee table. I knew the zoning laws Tyler ignored. I knew the liquidity issues Lucas created. I knew the firm's debt-to-equity ratio better than the CFO. Being invisible gave me access. Nobody hides their passwords from the furniture. Nobody shreds documents in front of the ghost in the corner. I had spent a decade gathering intelligence, not because I wanted to be part of their club, but because I knew one day their incompetence would threaten my survival. I didn't argue with him. I didn't beg for a seat at the table. I simply nodded, took a sip of water, and thought about the document currently sitting in my purse. The document that proved I didn't need him to give me the portfolio. I had already bought the company that owned it. "To the future," James toasted, raising his glass high. "To the future," the brothers echoed. I raised my glass too. But my toast was silent. My family had a very specific narrative about me. In their version of the story, I was a low-level research assistant at a boutique investment bank, a job James assumed I got because of his name, not my resume. He liked that version. It made me small. It made me manageable. It allowed him to pat me on the head at Christmas and ask if I was still filing papers for the big boys. The truth was a little more complicated. And a lot more expensive. I wasn't a research assistant. I was a senior associate in distressed assets and mergers and acquisitions. My specialty wasn't filing papers. It was identifying companies that were bleeding out, buying their debt for pennies on the dollar and restructuring them until they were profitable again. I spent my days dissecting balance sheets that looked exactly like my father's, bloated, arrogant, and structurally unsound. For 5 years, I lived a double life. By day, I was closing 8-figure deals in boardrooms my father couldn't get a meeting in. By night, I was the dutiful, quiet daughter nodding along while Tyler explained the vision behind a building he hadn't started construction on because he forgot to file for permits. I didn't plan to buy sterling and stone. Initially, I just wanted to make sure my inheritance wasn't being vaporized. 6 months ago, I used my access, the passwords James kept on a sticky note under his keyboard, to run a forensic audit on the firm. What I found wasn't a business. It was a piggy bank. The firm was hemorrhaging cash. James had leveraged the commercial holdings to the hilt, and where was the money going? It wasn't going into development, it wasn't going into marketing, it was flowing directly into consulting fees for shell companies owned by Tyler and Lucas. Tyler had billed the firm $300,000 for architectural research that consisted of a 3-week trip to Milan. Lucas was on the payroll as a brand ambassador with a salary of $250,000 a year, despite having never brought in a single client. James was cannibalizing the company's equity to fund his son's delusions of grandeur. He was burning the furniture to heat the house, all while telling himself he was a titan of industry. I realized then that there would be no legacy to inherit. If I waited for James to retire, I would inherit a crater. So I did what I do best. I stopped being a daughter and started being an acquirer. I set up a shell corporation, Nemesis Holdings. It was cheeky, but I knew James never read the paperwork closely enough to catch the reference. I started buying up the firm's debt. I approached the minority shareholders, the silent partners James had ignored and insulted for years. They were desperate to get out. They saw the ship sinking. When I offered them a buyout at 12% above market value, they didn't ask who was behind the curtain, they just signed. It took me 4 months to acquire 49% of the company. I needed 51. I needed the controlling stake. That was the hard part. That was the impossible part. James held the rest locked up in the family trust. Then, 3 weeks ago, a notification popped up on my terminal. A block of voting shares had hit the private market. They weren't James's shares. They were the shares held in trust for the future leadership. The shares belonged to Tyler and Lucas. I stared at the screen, watching the numbers blink. My brothers weren't just incompetent, they were traitors. They were selling pieces of the crown jewels to pay for their mistakes. I didn't hesitate. I clicked buy. The transfer cleared in seconds. The money left my account. The control entered my portfolio. I sat back in my chair looking at the confirmation screen. I officially owned 51% of Sterling and Stone. I owned the building. I owned the brand. I owned the desk my father was sitting at. I didn't say a word. I printed the acquisition deed, slid it into a black envelope, and waited for Father's Day. I pulled off the highway and parked at a scenic overlook. The city lights were a glittering carpet below me, indifferent and beautiful. I killed the engine, and for a moment I just breathed. The silence inside the car was absolute, a stark contrast to the storm I knew was raging in my phone. I picked it up. It was hot to the touch, vibrating every few seconds with a new assault. 57 notifications. I scrolled through them, my thumb swiping up with clinical detachment. Tyler, are you insane? Dad is literally hyperventilating. Bring the car back now. Lucas jokes over Morgan. You ruined the vibe. Nobody thinks this is funny. James, voicemail Morgan. Pick up the phone. I don't know what kind of sick prank you think you're pulling with that fake document, but stealing my car is a felony. I'm calling the police if you're not back in 10 minutes. I listened to the voicemail twice. His voice wasn't scared yet. It was annoyed. It was the voice of a man who still believed he was in charge, scolding a disobedient child. He hadn't read the document. Or if he had, his brain had rejected it like a bad organ transplant. He couldn't conceive of a reality where I had power over him. To him, I was just ruining the vibe. I didn't reply. I didn't defend myself. I didn't explain. I swiped to the settings and tapped Do Not Disturb. The screen went dark. The silence returned. I sat there for an hour, watching the city breathe, knowing that tomorrow the air in that glass tower would change forever. Monday morning broke gray and sharp. I dressed in a suit I had bought for this specific day, charcoal wool tailored to within an inch of its life. I didn't wear jewelry. I didn't wear makeup to soften my features. I looked like a blade. I arrived at the Sterling and Stone building at 8 a.m. The lobby was quiet. I walked past the reception desk where I used to smile apologetically when I visited my father. Today I didn't smile. I walked straight to the security station. Good morning, Miss Sterling, the head of security said. He looked nervous. He had received the memo I sent at 4 a.m. Good morning, Frank, I said. You have the new access protocols. Yes, ma'am. Updated as of midnight. Good. I took the elevator to the executive floor. The doors slid open with a soft chime. The office was exactly as I remembered it, plush carpets, mahogany walls, the scent of old money and stale ambition. But the energy was different. The staff, the assistants, the junior analysts, the people my father ignored looked up as I walked by. They knew. Rumors travel faster than light in a corporate vacuum. At 9:15 a.m., the elevator chimed again. James strode out. He was wearing his power suit, but his face was haggard. He looked like a man who hadn't slept, a man running on caffeine and rage. He marched toward the glass doors of the CEO's office, his office. He reached for the handle. He swiped his keycard. Beep, 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 red light. He frowned, swiped it again. Harder this time. Beep, beep, beep. What the hell, he muttered, rattling the handle. He turned to the assistant, a young woman named Sarah, whom he had called Sherry for 3 years. Sherry, open this door. My card is demagnetized. Sarah didn't move. She looked down at her desk, her face pale. I can't, Mr. Sterling. What do you mean you can't open the damn door? She can't open it because it's not your office anymore, James. My voice cut through the lobby like a gunshot. James spun around. I was standing in the doorway of the boardroom, flanked by 2 lawyers from the firm's legal counsel. They weren't smiling. Morgan James snarled, stepping toward me. Enough of this. Give me my car keys and stop embarrassing yourself. You're fired. You hear me? You're done. I didn't read the fine print, Dad, I said, my voice calm level lethal. You can't fire me. but I can trespass you. I signaled to Frank, who stepped out of the shadows with 2 other guards. Mr. Sterling, Frank said, his voice respectful but firm. I need to ask you to step away from the door. James looked at Frank, then at me, then back at the red light on the card reader. The reality of the situation began to crack the enamel of his ego. This wasn't a prank. The locks had been changed. The guards were taking orders from me. You, he whispered, the words strangling in his throat. You can't do this. I built this place. You built the facade, I corrected. I bought the foundation. I turned and walked into the boardroom. Frank, bring him in. And bring his sons. It's time for the shareholder meeting. The boardroom was cold. The air conditioning was set to 68 degrees, a temperature James had always insisted on because he said it kept people awake. Now he was shivering in his chair. Tyler and Lucas sat across from him, refusing to make eye contact. They looked like schoolboys waiting for the principal, not the future titans of industry James had bragged about at dinner. James slammed his hand on the mahogany table. It was a weak gesture, the echo hollow in the large room. This is illegal, he spat, though his voice lacked conviction. You can't just buy a company out from under its CEO. I control the voting shares through the family trust. You might own debt, Morgan, but you don't have the votes to remove me. I still own 51%. I walked to the head of the table. I didn't sit. I placed a second file folder on the polished wood. That was true 6 months ago, Dad. But you made a mistake. You assumed the people you entrusted with your legacy actually cared about it. I opened the folder. Inside were copies of wire transfers and stock sale agreements. You see, James, I didn't buy the controlling stake from strangers. I didn't have to launch a hostile bid on the open market. I bought the shares privately. I looked at my brothers. From Tyler and Lucas. James froze. He turned his head slowly like a rusted machine to look at his sons. Tyler was staring at the carpet. Lucas was chewing his thumbnail, a nervous habit he hadn't outgrown since childhood. What is she talking about? James whispered. Tell him, Tyler, I said. Tell him about the online gambling debt. Tell him about the $80,000 you lost in a single weekend in Vegas. I turned to Lucas. And you. Tell him about the crypto scheme. Tell him how you leveraged your future inheritance to cover a margin call. We needed cash, Tyler mumbled, his voice cracking. Morgan offered us a buyout. She said it was just a shell company. We didn't know it was her. You sold my company, James roared, standing up so fast his chair tipped over. You sold my life's work to a shell company. We didn't think it mattered, Lucas yelled back, defensive now. You always said the company was ours eventually anyway. We just cashed out early. I watched them turn on each other. It was pathetic. It was inevitable. This is the problem with the empire you built, Dad, I said, my voice cutting through their shouting match. You spent 30 years teaching these boys that money was the only metric of success. You taught them that loyalty was something you bought, not something you earned. You created a counterfeit legacy. I walked over to the window, looking out at the city. You thought you were raising heirs. You were raising parasites. They didn't sell you out because they hate you. They sold you out because you taught them that everything is for sale. You valued their arrogance over my competence. You valued their gender over my loyalty. And in the end, the golden boys you worshipped were the ones who held the knife while I signed the check. James sank back into his chair, or tried to, but it was on the floor. He slumped against the table, looking from his sons to me. The betrayal wasn't that I had beaten him. The betrayal was that the reflection he had been staring at for 30 years, his sons, was finally clear. They weren't kings in waiting. They were just greedy children who had sold their father for a wire transfer. I own 51%, I repeated. And as the majority shareholder, I am calling for a vote of no confidence in the current CEO. I looked at Tyler and Lucas. Raise your hands, boys. You're voting with me today. It's in the contract. Slowly, shamefully, my brothers raised their hands. James put his head in his hands. The vote was unanimous. Tyler and Lucas didn't stay to comfort their father. They didn't offer to help him pack his things. As soon as the vote was recorded, they scrambled for the exit like rats, sensing the ship had finally snapped in half. I watched them go, 2 men who had spent their entire lives shielded by their gender, now running from the consequences of their greed. The heavy door clicked shut, leaving James and me alone in the silence of the boardroom. He looked older than 55. In the span of 20 minutes, he had aged a decade. The arrogance that usually held his spine straight had evaporated, leaving behind a man slumped in a chair that was no longer his. He looked around the room as if he had never seen it before, as if the mahogany and the glass were alien artifacts. I don't understand, he whispered. It wasn't a demand anymore. It was a plea. I saw the reports. I saw the personnel files. You were. How did you build the capital? How did you move that much money without me seeing it? I walked over to the head of the table. I didn't sit in his chair. I leaned against the edge of the table looking down at him. You didn't see it because you weren't looking, I said. And even if you had looked, your brain wouldn't have processed it. He frowned, his eyes glassy. What are you talking about? It's a psychological concept, Dad. A cognitive blind spot. You constructed a worldview where only men could build empires. In your reality, Tyler and Lucas were the heirs because they shared your last name and your gender. I was just scenery. I was the furniture in the background of your legacy. I crossed my arms. I could have left the acquisition contracts on your desk, and you would have used them as coasters. You didn't ignore me because I was hiding. You ignored me because acknowledging my competence would have destroyed your ego. To see me as a threat, you would have had to admit that a daughter could be smarter than a son, and you simply couldn't do that. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open. The truth of it was hitting him harder than the financial loss. He hadn't been outsmarted by a stranger. He had been outsmarted by his own prejudice. I sat at your dinner tables for 26 years, I continued, my voice, soft but unyielding. I listened to you brag about deals you didn't understand. I watched you bleed this company dry to fund my brother's failures. And every time you interrupted me, every time you looked past me to ask Tyler for his opinion, you gave me more cover. You built the shadows I hid in. James looked down at his hands. They were shaking. I thought I was protecting the family. No, I corrected. You were protecting your reflection. You looked at my brothers and saw yourself. You looked at me and saw nothing. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a final envelope. It wasn't black. It was a standard white HR envelope. This is your severance package, I said, sliding it across the polished wood. It includes 3 months of salary and the continuation of your health benefits for the remainder of the year. It is standard for an outgoing executive who has been terminated for cause. He looked at the envelope with revulsion. Terminated for cause. Gross negligence. Misappropriation of company funds. Breach of fiduciary duty. I listed the charges calmly. You're lucky I'm not pressing criminal charges for the embezzlement regarding the brothers' consulting fees. Consider that my final gift to the family. James stood up slowly. He looked small. The titan of industry was gone, replaced by a man holding a white envelope and a set of car keys that no longer worked. Morgan, he said, his voice cracking, I'm your father. I know, I said. That's why I'm giving you 10 minutes to clear out your desk before security escorts you from the building. A stranger would have only gotten 5. I turned my back on him and walked to the window. I heard him hesitate, waiting for me to turn around, waiting for the daughter who used to beg for his approval to crack. But that daughter didn't exist anymore. She had been acquired and restructured. I heard his footsteps retreat. I heard the door open and close. The room was silent. And for the first time in my life, the silence didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like ownership. The door clicked shut and the sound was definitive. It was the sound of a chapter ending not with a bang but with the quiet authority of a lock engaging. I stood alone in the boardroom. The space was vast, designed to intimidate, designed to make people feel small. But as I looked around, the room didn't feel oppressive anymore. It felt like a blank canvas. I walked over to the massive window that spanned the length of the far wall. The city was waking up below me. Traffic was a river of light flowing through the arteries of the business district. From this height, the cars looked like toys, the people like ants. It was the view my father had coveted, the view he had used to measure his worth. But to me, it was just a view. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened my contacts list. James Sterling, block. Tyler Sterling, block. Lucas Sterling, block. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel guilty. I felt the specific weightless sensation of a diver cutting the weights loose before ascending. They had been anchors dragging me down into their dysfunction, demanding I drown so they could float. Cutting them loose wasn't cruelty. It was survival. I walked over to the head of the table where my briefcase sat. Next to it were the keys to the Porsche. The heavy fob gleamed under the fluorescent lights. I picked them up, feeling the cool metal in my palm. Yesterday, this car had been a weapon. It had been a symbol of rebellion, a getaway vehicle from a life I could no longer tolerate. Today it was just a car. A nice car certainly, but just a machine. It didn't hold power over me. Nothing did anymore. I dropped the keys into my desk drawer and slid it shut. I sat down in the CEO's chair. It was comfortable. It fit. I spun it around to face the door, ready for the work to begin. There were audits to run, restructuring plans to approve, and a culture to rebuild from the ground up. It would be hard work. It would be lonely work at times. But it would be my work. They wanted me to be invisible. They spent 26 years trying to erase me from the narrative of this family. They thought that if they ignored me hard enough, I would simply cease to exist. But they forgot the fundamental rule of architecture. The most important part of the building isn't the spire that touches the clouds. It's the foundation buried in the dark, holding everything up. I wasn't invisible. I was essential. And now I was the air they breathed everywhere, unavoidable and in complete control. If you've ever had to build your own empire in silence because no one believed in you, share this story. Let them know we see you.